sides of Gary Lawless. And there are way too many to cover here this morning. But one I do want to note is Gary's work using poetry to give a voice to veterans, homeless people, immigrant communities, and handicapped children and adults. For this work, last year, Gary was the recipient of the Constant H. Carlson Public Humanities Prize, given by the Maine Humanities Council. The council cited Gary's community work as, quote, a spectacular example of how poetry can make a meaningful difference in the lives of Mainers from all backgrounds. Now, another side of Gary is world traveler, and today we're going to hear about his most recent travel and the month he spent in Venice. It's a great honor for me to introduce my friend and my teacher, Gary Lawless.
And I think he just took my notes. Did you just take my notes?
I did.
Yeah. Thank you, Yeah. You want me to improvise?
Where's your rhythm?
He's going to say he wrote these poems. Thanks. These guys, I mean, going to senior college has opened up a whole new world of friendships for me, and these wonderful people that I've met in the last 6 years working or playing at senior college, and the kind of events that they put on. Look at how many people are here. This is wonderful. Thank you. I might beat the DePonte attendance. I'm trying to beat the record. So thank you all. So Mark sort of hinted that I just spent a month. Is this working? Can you hear me now? Raise it towards my mouth. It says. I can hear myself, but I can always hear myself. It's tiring. So I've been to Italy a dozen times, and I have 5 books of poems out in Italy. I actually have fans in Italy, which is, I have to go a long way to get fans. But friends, I've been to Venice 4 times, and friends there suggested that I apply to a foundation in Venice called the Emily Harvey Foundation, which was created by a group of Fluxus artists in New York City, and they have an apartment building, an office building, and a gallery in Venice. And if you get a residency with them, you get a free apartment in Venice for a month. And then you get use of their office and that kind of thing too. And you get introduced to a lot of people. So I applied, and I sent this email off to Venice. And, you know how you send things into the cloud and you don't know with whom you're speaking. And I got an email back from the director there in Venice, and it said, "Dear Mr. Lawless, did you know Priscilla Berry, or do you know David Berry in Bodenham, Maine?" And anyone who's hung around chickens knows Priscilla and David. And so I wrote back and said, "Sure, I know those guys." And the director wrote back and said, "I was David's roommate at Bowdoin College in 1965. So then I thought, maybe I'll get this grant. This is good work. But I had to have a project. Even though I wasn't going there as a visual artist, I was going there as a poet, they wanted me to have a project. And I'll just briefly tell you how that came about. Both of my grandfathers were involved in the quarry industries in Vermont and in Maine. And so I've sort of been interested in granite for a while. And when I first went to Venice, having no idea what it was going to be like, I got there and I just looked around, and basically I'm on these little pieces of sand and mud with no visible source of stone, and yet everything's built out of stone. So I really wanted to know literally where the stone came from. It's just, this talk is not about getting stoned in Venice, this talk is about where the stone came from. I could give the other talk, but I won't. So sort of in honor of my grandfathers, I started looking around, and I made a list of the stone that I was curious about, and then while I was there, my list expanded. So I'll just give you that initial list. I wanted to know about white Istrian stone. I wanted to know about marble. I wanted to know about salt. I wanted to know about sand. I wanted to know about lapis lazuli. And then once I got there, I found out a lot about sediment and a lot about particulate produced by the petrochemical industry and the hellish industry known as cruise ships. So I learned a lot about particulate too. So those are kind of the subject areas. But I wasn't there and as a historian or an art historian or an architecture historian or a researcher or an academic. I was there as a poet. So my approach was different. So if during the course of this talk you realize that what I just said isn't actually true, just either I'm being a poet or I'm being very presidential. So this is my State of the Union. But I'm just wondering, how many of you here have actually been to Venice? Ooh, wow. Most of you. So you will know when I'm lying. This is good. Open to it. So as the many of you who have been there will know, it's basically 124 islands connected by 438 bridges. And there is no visible source of stone, and there's almost no visible source of wood. There's almost no visible source of life when you're walking around. Everything is either built on or paved over. And Mayor Bernaro right now is selling off some open public spaces to developers to build more hotels to hold more people. And currently running a campaign to chase everyone who lives there actually off the island. And I know this because his parents, the mayor's parents, are two of my best friends in Venice, and I visited them. All 4 of my trips to Venice, I've hung out with his parents. The first 3 trips, I didn't know they had a son, because they will not speak about it. The 4th time, I knew they were the parents of the mayor, but none of us spoke about the mayor. We had an interesting time avoiding it. But when you come to Venice, you see all these buildings, right? Even for those of you who haven't been here, imagine this. It's pretty flat. It's mud and sand. You're in a lagoon, a lot of salt marsh around you, what's left of it that hasn't been destroyed. But there are all these buildings, and you wonder what's bearing those loads? What's keeping those buildings standing? What's underneath? Well, maybe you don't, but I do. And you find out that underneath all of those buildings are literally several million Poles. Not Polish people, but pieces of wood. There's probably a few Poles in the canal there. So there are millions, literally, millions of trees underneath all those buildings. So first of all, where all that wood came from, where it come from. I mean, so there's a lot of wood that came down the rivers. A lot of wood that came from Slovenia, a lot of wood that came from what's now Croatia. Most of it was brought to the Zatare, on that long flat continente where they unloaded the barges of wood. And so underneath all those buildings are many poles. On top of the poles, usually there's a layer of planking or some kind of layer of wood. And on top of that, in many of the buildings, is a layer of white stone that was quarried on the Istrian Peninsula. The Istrian Peninsula is just east of Italy now, but it used to be part of the Venetian Republic. It's now part of Croatia. And it has this white stone that's really impermeable. It keeps the water from rising up into the bottom of the building in a really substantial way. So it's a really great stone for that, but they've also used it to build walls and columns and to create statues. At one point there was a law passed that you couldn't use stone that looked like white Istrian stone but really wasn't. There was actually a law that kept you using that particular stone. The Croats may have had a market for that, I don't know. I've actually been to a couple of the quarries in Croatia now. Not a big tourist item. I went to Croatia. I went to the Istrian Peninsula in my past life, which was when I was looking for relics, which was The first 10 times I went to Italy, I was looking for body parts and blood. And I had been to Istanbul and had seen St. Euphemia, but I heard that there was a relic of St. Euphemia in Rovine, which is down on the southwestern side of the Istrian Peninsula. And there's the major quarry for white Istrian stone is right outside Rovine. So now I'm making pilgrimages to quarries. My life is getting weirder. My wife is wondering why we're looking at large holes in the ground, but it's... So when you're walking around Venice, you're seeing all this stone. All of it had to come there from somewhere else by boat. So then I wonder, who built the boats? What did they look like? Where were they built? Where did the wood for the boats come from? Venice is a very wood-consumptive place. They had a huge navy. They had a large population who were all heating with wood. All the buildings had wood underneath. Then you go to Murano, and there are these glass furnaces, which were until the 1950s fired by wood. Very, very high consumption of wood. At one point, the Venetian Republic surveyed the oak forests all around Veneto and marked those trees and said these belong, sort of like the King's Pines in Maine. They said these oaks belong to the Venetian. But that's not a stone. I've wandered off already. All right, to get back to Venice. Most of the tourism that goes to Venice makes an immediate beeline for St. Mark's Square. I started feeling really sorry for St. Theodore. Because before it was St. Mark's Square, before there was a cathedral to St. Mark, there was a statue of St. Theodore there and a church for St. Theodore. But St. Theodore was seen as, his story came out of Turkey, and they, at a point they saw him as too related to Turkey, so they had to have a new saint. So they got rid of St. Theodore. They took him down for a while. He's still there. And put him in the garden in the Doge's palace. And I wanted to read, where's St. Theodore? He also was the first saint that battled the dragon. But that got morphed into St. George, and the dragon in the statue at St. Mark's Square is actually a crocodile, because they got a crocodile statue instead. But if you go to the Doge's palace, there's a little garden there with the original statue of Theodore, and I just want to read, because this illustrates the diversity of the stone. The head of St. Theodore, which is probably actually a head of Constantine, but it'll work. The head of St. Theodore is made of white marble from Western Turkey. His shield that he's holding is white Istrian stone. His arms and the dragon under him are marmoran marbles from the Sea of Marmara, so again, Turkey. His armor is either Lunanese marble, and Luni was the water port for the Carrara marble quarries. So his armor is either Lunanese marble or Pentelic marble, which comes from a quarry near Athens, and the Parthenon is also built of Pentelic and so on. So that's just that one statue has stone from all these different places, and it's a conglomerate. So there's still a statue of St. Theodore. There are two columns right outside St. Mark's Cathedral, and on top of one is another statue of St. Theodore, and instead of a dragon, there's a crocodile. And on the other column is a lion, the symbol. But the lion came from Asia and didn't have wings, so when the lion got to St. Mark's, they had to put wings on it, so the lion now has wings. So that's, already you're starting to sense the great city is built on theft. Like most of it, it's built on theft. It gets worse. So St. Theodore was replaced by St. Mark, and they built this big cathedral for St. Mark, but they didn't have St. Mark. He had died in Alexandria, which was at that time controlled by the Muslims. So a group of Venetians went to Alexandria and stole his relics, stole his bones. And they were trying to figure out how to get them back on the boat, to get them out of Alexandria and back to Venice. And the customs agents were all Muslims. So they took a barrel and filled it with pork. And in the barrel, they put his bones. And when you walk into St. Mark's, over on the right-hand side, there's mosaics going across the front. And if you look at the one on the right-hand side, there's a big barrel. And then all these guys in turbans going like this. And unless you know this story, that's a very mysterious image. Like, what's going on here? So Mark was smuggled out of Alexandria and brought and put into the cathedral. Since then, the cathedral has actually been destroyed once, and miraculously his body was unaffected by that. But when you get into relics, there are a lot of miraculous things. So then the whole front, the beautiful front of St. Mark's, which faces west, and we would go there just before sunset in the afternoon when the sun would just directly hit the front of that building. And it was amazing. I mean, you think you're in some other world, and you are. It's apparently Chinese. But, I don't know. That was the major language being spoken all around you. But you're looking at the front of St. Mark's, and all the marble, and the columns, and the horses, all came from Constantinople in the year 1204, because there were some primarily French, crusaders who wanted to start the Fourth Crusade. And they told the Pope, we're going to raise a big army, we're going to go get Jerusalem back for you. And the Pope was all for it. So those crusaders went to Venice, and they weren't going to go by land, they were going to go by boats, so they needed a lot of boats. So they went to Venice, and they talked to the Doge, who's sort of like the governor or the mayor, except he's there for life, Doge Dandolo. And he made this deal, he and the merchants of Venice, there's a phrase, I just coined it myself. So he made a deal with them that they had to pay for the boats and the sailors, a huge sum of money. And the crusade didn't raise quite as much capital or quite as many people as they thought it was going to raise. So all of a sudden these noblemen are in a huge amount of debt to the Venetians. The Venetians will not back off. They're business people. We don't care if you're going on a crusade, you owe us money. And so they leave Venice, and they go down the coast, and instead of going over towards the Holy Land, they hook a left. And they spend one winter on an island off Greece, which they overran, first of all. At that point, the Venetians are excommunicated by the Pope, because he can see what's going on. A few months later, they lay siege to Constantinople, which is primarily Muslims and Greek Orthodox, so nobody the Catholics like. So they lay siege. Eventually, they win. There's a hellish mess made by the Crusaders as they slaughter people and loot everything. And oddly enough, a whole lot of this stuff ends up back in Venice. So now there's all this, even on the southwest corner of the treasury, there's this little statue which some of you may see. There's two guys on the front and two guys on the side, and there's a little bench in front of it. You can sit there. But when you go and look at those guys, one of the guys on the side is missing a foot. And there's a white sort of replacement foot. The foot is still in Constantinople on the front of the building. So you can actually go, I've been there, you can actually go and see the foot. So you know exactly where those guys are taken from. The horses, the wonderful horses that are there came from the chariot racing grounds in Constantinople. Usually horses in chariot races, there were 4 horses. But that's sort of a mythical, historical thing, because also the sun's chariot is pulled by 4 horses, the Caesars were pulled in chariots by 4 horses, the quadriga, it's kind of a big deal to have these 4 horses. So the Venetians brought those 4 beautiful horses back to Venice from Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. But If you're Greek Orthodox, you still call it Constantinople. You refuse to call it Istanbul. And I like the Greek Orthodox because they all have long white beards. They're nice people. So I call it Constantinople. But so the horses come from Constantinople to Venice. And they're these, if those of you who have seen the real ones, which are now inside the building, they're amazing. And they're still not sure where they actually came from. Because people look at them and they think they must be bronze, but it turns out they're like 90 or 95% copper. And they're really amazing horses. And so they came to Venice. Years later, when Napoleon overruns Venice, he takes the horses to Paris. They go up on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Then Waterloo happens. The horses come back to Venice. There's a big party. When they bring the horses in by barge to St. Mark's, and there's a big party to welcome the horses back. Then the First World War happens, so the horses are moved to Rome, and then the horses come back. So these horses are quite well traveled. And then late in the 60s, they thought that maybe the particulate, which I'll get to later, or maybe not, that the horses being outside were being affected by the air and the air quality, and so they were moved inside, and there are copies out. The horses also have they all have collars on because they were beheaded in order to ship them. In order for them to travel, they cut their heads off. So now they have what looks like collars on, but it's because they've been beheaded by the Venetians, of course. So they also brought a lot of relics back from Constantinople, because St. Helen and Constantine wanted Constantinople to become the Rome of the East. And one of the things they wanted to do was to have a better relics collection than the Vatican. So St. Helen had a dream that told her where the true cross was, so she went and got the true cross. She got the marble steps that Jesus walked down after being married. It's quite a scene. So Doge Dandolo he and his people collected relics that came back. Venice did okay in this deal. They may not have made cash out of the rental agreement with the Crusaders, but they did really well. They overran Constantinople and got to loot it and send it all back to Venice. Dandolo died in Constantinople. He's in the Hagia Sophia. There's a little plaque. We don't really know exactly where he is because the building was destroyed once. But for those of you who saw the Dan Brown movie or read the Dan Brown book, Doge Dandolo plays a little part in the Istanbul. Okay. Now, one of the relics, one of my favorite relics that came back with the Crusaders, so-called. I mean, Crusaders is kind of that's a generous thing to call these guys, Crusaders. But you remember that the Bush called the Desert Wars a crusade at one point. So one of the things they brought back was my favorite person in Venice, St. Lucy. And I've been to see St. Lucy a lot of times, and every time I go by the church, I talk to her a little bit. My father would call it prayer, but I just call it talking to St. Lucy. So I'm just, while I was there, I'm supposed to be writing. I didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing for this foundation. So one day I was out walking around and I met the director, and I said, "What am I supposed to be doing? I feel really guilty. What am I supposed to be doing?" And he said, "Walking around, getting ideas, taking in images." Oh, I'm okay. But what I actually did was I felt that I was setting up a pirate radio station, that I was broadcasting once a day. So once a day I would type up and send out what I'd been writing that day. And I had a little victims list of people who got I think 28 different pieces that went out, but most people didn't get all of them. But I just want to read this because this is my piece for St. Lucy, and I really love St. Lucy. We walked at the Cannaregio to the church of San Geremia, just off the Strada Nuova, where the body of St. Lucy lies in a glass case with a silver mask across her eyes. we come to honor Lucy and to honor Dante. Dante avows himself to be a fedele, a devotee of Lucy. In Canto 2 of the Inferno, the Virgin Mary speaks to Lucy, seeking some help for Dante. Lucy urges Beatrice to come to Dante's aid. Later in Purgatory, Lucy carries the sleeping Dante up the lower slopes of Mount Purgatory. In Paradise, Dante will seat Lucy on a throne with John the Baptist on her right, and on John's right, St. Anne, the Mother of Mary. Lucy is, quote, the enemy of all who are cruel. She's the patron saint of illumination and sight, both outer and inner. Dante may have credited her for relief from an illness of the eyes. She is often portrayed as divine wisdom, carrying a lighted lamp in her hands, or celebrated by Scandinavians with candles on their heads. Santa Lucia, the Saint of Light, was originally from Syracuse, Sicily. One version of her story has her consecrating herself to Christ after a visit from St. Agatha in a dream, renouncing matrimony and giving all of her belongings to the poor. This did not go over well with her husband-to-be. She was imprisoned in tortures, her eyes were dug out, but she put them back into place. Another version has her removing her own eyes to discourage a suitor. She's often depicted carrying a silver tray on which rest her eyes. In the end, she was decapitated. Her relics traveled to Constantinople, but when the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, the Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo brought Lucy's bones to Venice. In 1981, thieves stole all of her bones except for her head, but they were recovered 5 weeks later on her feast day. On her feast day. A miracle. Miraculously, her body is also claimed to be in Rome, Naples, Verona, Milan, Lisbon, as well as Germany, Spain, and France. Her feast day originally corresponded with the winter solstice in celebration of the return of light. We have come to pay our respects to Lucy, to Dante, to illumination, to go, to see, to seek the light of divine wisdom. Hello, Lucy. She's in a glass case, and she has a little silver mask over her eyes, but her hands and her feet are bare, and she's in a really beautiful dress. My wife really likes the dress that Lucy's wearing. It's quite lovely. And she's in the back of the Church of San Jeremiah, which is one of the first churches after you go to the train station and start walking, Per San Marco, as every sign says. She's one of the first churches on your right as you're headed down. She's worth saying hello to. So when the first people came to Venice, they were people who were escaping influxes of other people from the north and who were attacking villages and robbing and raiding. And they came out to the islands and originally built out of reeds and mud and wood, and then started making bricks and then bringing in stone and wood from other places. And their first real trade item was, oddly enough, not oddly, they were in a salt marsh. They were in salt marshes and salt water out on the other side of the Lido. So their first real trade item was salt. And eventually they created, there's a whole section of Venice that used to be salt warehouses. And they made it, well, I'll just read this. The salt has always been here in these salty lagoons. The salt is everywhere, in the ground, in the water, in the air, in the fog, in the wood and stone, and in our bodies. Roman records from the first half of the 6th century mention salt as a bartered currency for wheat and other products of the mainland. By the early 1200s, there were 119 salt works in the lagoon, especially in the Cannaregio and the Dorsoduro. Venice began to buy up. See, this is what Venice did. They would corner the market on things. So Venice began to buy up all the salt in the eastern Mediterranean, and they passed a law, the Ordo Salis, or the Salt Rule, that ships could not come back to Venice after trading empty. If they were going to come back empty, they had to fill themselves with salt. So they would bring back salt to Venice and then store them in the warehouses. So this is, Venice eventually created a salt monopoly, controlling salt sales from Puglia, Sicily, and Sardinia to Crete and Cyprus. Huge warehouses were built to store the salt. These saloni were reinforced to support the enormous weight of vast quantities of salt, so more wood and more stone underneath the buildings. More than 20 of these warehouses were built in the 16th century. It was a very salt became the #1 trade item in Venice, controlled the salt trade. But like most resources, they ran out of salt. They used up all the local salt. So now all the salt in Venice is imported. All the wood in Venice is imported. All the stone in Venice is imported. And now Mary Sheldon met up with me in Venice, and she helped. When she came, I had been out to Murano. Murano is where the glassmakers were. There's another island where the tanneries were because they smelled so bad that they didn't want them right next to, the church for St. Lucy or something. Awful. Oh, sorry. That's a good word. Awful. It happens without me knowing. So Mary went out to Murano because I was thinking about glass, and I went out to Murano and I was reading about making glass. And the production of glass requires huge amounts of sand. And it has to be sand with very few irregularities, or the glass is not going to be high quality glass. So I wondered where the sand, where is the sand coming from? Because it's yet another resource that they probably ran out of. So Mary went out to Murano and found that it's coming from Fontainebleau, France. And Fontainebleau, France is not on the coast. So it's a glacial deposit of this really good sand with very few impurities that's being mined in France and brought to the island of Murano in the lagoon and turned into this beautiful glass. And yet most of the glass that's on sale in Murano is not Murano glass. It's from, the Chinese tourists come and buy it and take it back, not knowing that they're actually the source of this glass. Thank you for recycling. Sorry, it's just... If you spend a month in Venice, you get a little jaded, trying to walk around, and the streets are completely full of groups of 100 people with the same colored kerchief on, following the flag, and they all have earphones on now, so that they can hear what the guide is saying. They can't hear what you're saying to them. Which is a good thing for me, because my wife told me to stop saying such ugly things to people. So the sand used to come down the river from the Dolomites, from the mountains, and the sand there was this really good glacial sand that came down out of the Dolomites and gathered at the mouths of the rivers that come into the lagoon. But that was used up pretty quickly. So now the sand is imported. The lagoon, has a lot of rivers and sources of fresh water coming into it, and that it only, at this point, has 3 outlets to the ocean, so that the tides come in through these 3 major outlets. So the fresh water and the salt water are combining, and the lagoon is really pretty shallow in a lot of places. And so there was a need to control the natural sediments that were being brought into the lagoons. The Venetians have been dealing with natural sediments for hundreds of years now, because the sediments could build up, they could stop the flow of water in certain ways. Now the sediment is being unnaturally messed with. They've built a petrochemical refinery complex on the mainland right in back of the island, just west of the island, and built a canal that's the petrochemical canal, so these large petrochemical ships can come in. And now there are these boats from hell they call cruise ships that are coming in, and they're trying to figure out how to dredge in order to control it. There are all these insane ideas. The new mayor wants to have an underground tunnel that comes from the airport to Murano, to the island, and then a second tunnel that goes from Murano to the Arsenale in Venice proper, two underground. Imagine what the construction of two underground car tunnels will do to the lagoon. Is very, very, very fragile, right? And sedimentation. Every time a cruise ship or a large petrochemical ship comes in, the wash from those ships is constantly wearing away at the walls, the sedimentary walls of the canals. That stuff then they have to move it. They have to put it someplace. They're supposedly building new islands, but some of the islands they're building are of this unusable mud that's so contaminated that you can't really use it for anything else. It's a big problem. And then when the cruise ships come in, there's one canal that goes right along the front of St. Mark's, and some of the big cruise ships come in there, and they're so huge, when they're going by, they're vibrating. The motors are vibrating. I mean, they're setting up this vibration. This is a city of buildings built on poles. They don't have foundations. They're built on wooden poles. So the houses start vibrating. So now buildings are starting to move. Walls are starting to cave. Windows and doors start breaking or not working. And the mayor wants to, the largest cruise ships now have about 3,000 passengers. The mayor wants to get the new line of cruise ships that have up to 4,000 passengers. But so that is the sediment story, a little bit of it. The particulate story is that first the petrochemicals companies were releasing particulate into the air. At the refineries, the particulate was combining with the mist and rain and creating sulfuric acid, which then wears away all the stone. They don't even talk about what it does to people who inhale it, but if it wears away stone and you're inhaling it, it's probably not good for you, unless you've got gallstones or something, because then you'll wear them away. But then the cruise ships started coming in, and the cruise ships are basically large floating buildings. They're huge hotels, so they never shut off. They never shut off the motors, so even when they're docked, they're releasing particulate into the air, which is, again, combining with the kind of wet climate there. And in the last 20 years, a lot of the statuary has, the pace of its wearing has quickened. Is that understandable? Anyway, and there's all this beautiful stone all through town. Somebody asked me, well, one person before we started guessed that the stone was Carrara marble. Most of it isn't. But I've been reading about the Carrara workers were pretty much the first Italians to organize. And they were socialists and anarchists, and they organized the stone workers themselves. And then they started coming to America, and they opened, there was a quarry in Barry, Vermont, and at one point, 2/3 of the city of Barry claimed to be either socialist or anarchist. They brought Eugene V. Debs, Mother Jones, Bill Hayward. They brought most of the IWW organizers to Barry over a few years. And my grandfather's quarry was up on the Penobscot River in Wallow, in Frankfurt, not Wallow, Mosquito Mountain. And there they had Irish workers and Italian workers. And the Irish workers did the rough work, and the Italian workers did the fancy work. But they couldn't live in the same shanty town, so they had an Irish shanty town and an Italian shanty town, and on the weekends they would all go to Bangor and get drunk and beat each other up. They were all Catholic, though. They were all Catholic. But there's a point to this. The Italian workers in Frankfurt and Prospect tried to organize a union, and the Frankfurt Historical Society has the papers signed by the guys who wanted there to be a union, so you can still see the names of the workers who wanted to organized in Frankfurt, and I Prospect, and I just find that really kind of a nice heritage to be. But Carrara was the source of the early Romans loved this marble that came from Peiros, came from a Greek island. Virgil celebrates it in Book 6 of the Aeneid. But eventually they discovered their own local sources of marble, and Michelangelo's marble came primarily from Carrara, and it's just, and so I was looking into Carrara marble and the anarchists and socialists, and in August, 1/3 of the Carrara marble business was sold to the Bin Laden family. Because they need good sources of marble to build new shopping centers and various buildings in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So now the Bin Ladens own the Italian marble. Which is not that much different from the Crusaders overrunning Constantinople. I mean, there's this long, when you start looking at stone, there's this long history. Look at gold in the United States. There's a long history. Uranium. There's a long history of violence, theft, government control. I mean, it's just looking at stone brings you into all these pretty interesting places, I think. But I'm just obviously obsessed right now. I'm sorry, but you're all stuck in this room. So let me tell you, a different stuff. It used to be that when I went into galleries that had religious art, Christian art, I always looked for St. Jerome. So first I would just look for the color red, I would look for a red hat, I would look for a lion, I would look for some guy with a stone in his hand that he was probably using to keep himself awake while he was translating. This is... I'm laughing at Catholic stories. You're going to end up where I'm going. Careful. But anyway, but then I started reading about Carpaccio and this beautiful blue that Carpaccio and the Bellinis and some other Italian Venetian artists were using that was the most expensive pigment in Europe at the time. It was called ultramarine, so it's from over the sea. And it turned out that it was made from a lapis lazuli that came from a certain mountain range in eastern Afghanistan and was lugged out by donkeys, apart from that particular period, was lugged out by donkeys and then went on to the Silk Roads and ended up in Venice. And Venice became the source, early on the primary source, but it was a very expensive pigment, really expensive. And so I found, over there, I found paperwork showing that when the Doge would commission someone to do a painting and they wanted this particular blue, they would include in the commission a certain amount of pigment. So you would be paid money and, the painter would be paid money and pigment. But it was important. There was a cult of the Virgin that connected her with paradise and the sky, so they wanted this particular blue color in her cloak to connect her with that sense of paradise. So I'm just going to read this. Today in the Biennale's Iraq Pavilion, we saw 2 lapis lazuli seals from Ur, 2500 BC. Lapis lazuli came to Venice from Sar-Isang, the Valley of Stone in northeast Afghanistan, mountains with veins of blue. Carried in sacks by donkeys, it made its way to trade routes and found its way to Venice. Here the chemists went to work on the stone, turning it into a pigment called ultramarine from beyond the sea. This precious blue was extremely expensive, so it was used sparingly. The advent of ultramarine in Venice coincided with the popularity of the cult of the Virgin, and blue became associated with the deep celestial blue of heaven and with Mary, her veil, her cloak. It was used by Bellini, Carpaccio, Titian, Masaccio, Perugino, Michelangelo, and later, Vermeer. When you think of Girl with a Pearl Earring, I mean, he used a lot of ultramarine. He used a lot of it in that one painting. The most expensive pigment of the Renaissance, it was sometimes included in advance payment by the Doges and others. In 1501, Carpaccio received 4 ounces of ultramarine as it was, quote, customary to supply the painters with that costly color. In the early 19th century, chemists were able to create a less expensive synthetic variety, but it does not have the deep soul of lapis. We searched the churches of Venice for that blue, leading our souls to the sky. So, what I was doing, a lot of what I was doing was following these little side trails. I would find something out, and then I would go try to find places in Venice where I could learn more about it. At one point, I went to the Natural History Museum and I saw fossils. And I thought, creatures who've literally turned to stone. And they had a selection of dragonfly fossils, which were among the most beautiful things. Dragonflies are pretty great, but when a dragonfly fossil, it's just really. So I got, I wandered off on fossils for a while. So I spent the month you go to Venice and you don't go there thinking that you're always going to know where you're going. That'll spoil your time to Venice. You go there to get lost. And you can't get lost because you're surrounded by water. You can't, you could get lost for a little while, but you can't ultimately get too lost there. So I was trying to be open to new ideas, so that like the sediment and the particulate, one of the things I thought of before I got there, and when I was there, I was trying to find environmental activists, and most of the activists I could find were deeply involved in the cruise ship business. And then I came back home to Maine, and the Chamber of Commerce just announced Maine is going to triple cruise ship visits. And the same edition of the Important paper, they also announced that right whale deaths had gone up in part because of cruise ships not obeying the speed limits. Which doesn't make me feel any better about cruise ships. But one of my favorite places in Venice is the Palazzo Fortuny. And Fortuny was a man of many talents. He was a painter, primarily a textile designer, a clothing designer. He also designed lighting systems for theater, for the stage. And the first time we went, we just went to his palazzo and saw this amazing display of things. But this time we went, Fortuny had a factory out in the Giudecca where his textiles were turned into, what textiles were turned into, but they have a showroom now, and you can go and look at all of his different textiles. And what I wanted to see, there's the Jesuit church in, the Jesuiti church in Venice is this amazingly beautiful place. And my wife went to Jesuit college. She was trained to think by the Jesuits. We sort of like the Jesuits. I like the idea of a Basque mystery cult, which I think Jesuits are basically a Basque mystery cult, created by Basque people. So we went to Santa Maria Assunta, which is the Jesuit church, and in that church there are these walls of marble that are made to look like drapes of fabric. So you walk in there, and they're coming from up on these little balconies and down, and they move, and they look like fabric, but it's stone, and it's gorgeous. And Fortuny went there, and he took the designs in that stone and made them into textiles. So you have stone becoming stone textile, becoming actual textile. And there's one piece called altare that's after there's a stone marble altar at the front of the church. So there's a Fortuny piece called altare that's a design from that stone, which is gorgeous. It's gorgeous. So we went over to see that at the showroom, and first of all, they were sort of surprised that we actually knew anything about it. So they were really sweet, and invited us to come back, and they gave us a special tour if we came back, and then I wrote a poem about the tour, and they put it in the Fortuny newsletter, and it was just really, Beth ended up buying a Fortuny piece. They like us. They're still emailing us. These are Venetian people, when you're interested in something below the superficial question, they open up. Just when you start asking questions that show that you appreciate what they're doing and you have some sense of what's happening, you get these wonderful conversations going, even if you can't understand most of it. So if you and Fortuny mixed his own colors. He created his own colors. So a lot of the pieces you can't get anymore because he never told anybody the formulas, and he's gone. So when they sell out of that color, it's gone. There are colors that come close to it, but the real Fortuny colors are getting rarer and rarer because he kept them to himself. But if you go to Venice, how many of you have been to it? To the Fortuna, to Plaza Fortuna? Barclay's been. Barclay lies a lot, so we don't know this. But you should go to the showroom. The showroom's out in the Giudeco Murano, because I was thinking about glass, and I went out to Murano, and I was reading about making glass, and the production of glass requires huge amounts of sand. And it has to be sand with very few irregularities, or the glass is not going to be high quality glass. So I wondered where the sand, where is the sand coming from? Because it's yet another resource that they probably ran out of. Well, I'm going to read you a couple poems, because that's actually what I was doing there. If that's okay, you can weather through these. I'm right now having them translated into Italian, but I won't read that. But see, I was supposed to be. I still don't know what I was supposed to be doing. And I just this morning, I've been emailing back and forth with the director, and I just this morning got this great letter saying, "You need to come back here. We're going to bring you back." So because there's all this, I keep finding out. He just turned me on to this incredible photographer who's taking photographs of Venice that have no people in them. And he just did a series of 100 churches, and they have no people in them. And now he's doing street scenes in Venice with no people in them. And that's the miracle to me. I mean, they're incredible. It looks like it's a ghost town. Which it is. It is a ghost town. So when I first got there, I was thinking about St. Theodore, losing out to St. Mark. And, at one point, we saw St. Catherine's right foot. I'm gradually seeing all of St. Catherine. Her head and her index finger are in Siena. I've seen them. Now I've seen her right foot. I have to go to the Vatican to see the rest of it. The relic trade is a wonderful way to travel in Italy. You go into a cathedral, you say, Dove Relique, you get shown something completely bizarre and wonderful. For those of you who are victims of my last winter wisdom talk, that was what it was all about. So we won't talk about the foreskin again. Well, I really love Jerome. I always look for pictures of Jerome. And I wanted to see this. Carpaccio has this beautiful painting of St. Augustine at the moment of Jerome's death. And it's just, it's so gorgeous, and it makes me cry. And, that shouldn't happen, right, Barton? Yeah. That was abused. And Jerome, he in most of his iconography, he has a lion, because he took the thorn out of the paw of the lion, and the lion became his friend. And Carpaccio has a wonderful series of Jerome and the lion showing up in town, and all these guys fleeing from the lion. They're really nice things. But anyway, this one is, I was standing looking at Carpaccio's, Augustine is at his desk, and there's this light coming in, and he's realizing in that moment that Jerome has just died. The stone in Jerome's hand, the thorn in the paw of the lion, red, revealed Jerome's dream. Red, she saw red, she said, Jerome, the book, the lion, the stone. The saint stands alone at the end of time. Or Carpaccio's Augustine in his studio. A spirit telling him that Jerome has just died. He is looking into that light. Looking into that light. The light where Jerome has gone. See, there are worries that Gary is turning Christian. When we stayed in Naples. I went down to Naples. I gave 2 poetry readings in Naples. The first night I gave a poetry reading in a yoga studio. So the audience was very quiet and had really good posture. The second night, I gave a poetry reading in a tattoo bar called Tilt. And can you guess why it's called Tilt? Pinball machines. So it was a bar with a performance space, a tattoo studio, and pinball machines. And I gave a reading. I gave a reading there, and when I stayed there, I stayed with the family of Maura Zarella, who was the language fellow for Italian about 2 years ago. And we stayed with her mother and father and her grandmother, none of whom spoke English. And this is southern Italy, so the grandmother came in, and she's all in black. She's kind of short. And she comes in and she looks at us, and the first thing she says, in Italian, not knowing that I can understand what she said, no, they're not Protestants, are they? And the second thing she said was, are they really married? He doesn't have a ring on. Welcome to Napoli. But she was great. I mean, I've been in more cathedrals in Italy than she has, so we ended up having this long talk about Padre Pio and relics. It was so much fun. And she eventually brought out the liqueur that she makes once a year out of walnuts and a few coffee beans and alcohol, and it sits for 2 years before you drink it. And so we started hallucinating with Nona, is basically what it was. It's really fun. That has nothing to do with anything, does it? That's getting stoned in Venice, yeah. But the town where Nona lived is a town called Avellino, and it's just east of Napoli. It's like 20 minutes on the bus east of Napoli. And they have a church there that has this mural, this really modern mural about war and peace and fascists and Jesus. And it's just, pretty much the whole congregation was aghast when it was first shown, but now they're really proud of it. So we went to see it, and the priest gave me a hardcover book about the mural. It's just really wonderful. And there's a place there called La Boca, and it's this huge spring. Huge. I mean, it's bigger than this library spring, and it supplies most of the water to Puglia. There's this pumping station there, and it sends water down to southern Italy, to places that don't have water. Clouds come down to the water's mouth, La Boca. The priest gives us a book of peace, Pace. St. Francis blesses the water, the land. As we leave Avellino, the clouds bless us with sky. When I went to Venice, I was also looking for birds. And there's no bird habitat there. It's all houses. You know, birds have to do Airbnb in order to stay in Venice, basically. Except for the pigeons and the seagulls. And their habitat is basically the arms and head of tourists in St. Mark's Square. They're standing like this. There are all these signs saying, do not feed the birds. And yet whole tour groups are standing there throwing out, more loaves of bread than Jesus could handle. So I wondered where, because that used to be this lagoon, this big salt marsh, a beautiful site for migratory birds. Great habitat. So I started wondering where the birds were. And it turned out that out on the far edges of the lagoon, there are islands that are now protected for the birds. And you can't get there unless you hire a pace limit. There's no commercial way to get there easily, which is a good thing. And there were all these birds up there, so this is just me looking for them. Where the outer islands meet the sea, walls of white Istrian stone, dunes, grasses and oak, migration routes for thousands of years, Kentish terns and plovers now disappearing, their places taken by kingfisher, herring gull, black-backed gull, all these coots, ducks, heron and geese, sparrowhawk, osprey and kite. What follows when we are gone forever? So the populations of birds are changing on those islands. The gulls and ducks are sort of taking over from the smaller wading birds. The habitats, the salt marsh in the lagoon they've really changed the makeup of the lagoon. There's less and less salt marsh. There were only, like I said, there were only 3 outlets. And I was going to look into sewage, but I thought, well, that's just kind of a thing that I don't really want to go. But Venice doesn't really have a good septic. They put it out into the lagoon, and they rely on the tides changing twice a day. Unfortunately, the dredging is messing that up. So eventually the tide might not change that at all. So it's going to smell. It's going to smell. It'll remind me. I grew up in Belfast in the 50s. We had chicken guts and blood at a long time. I mean, it smelled really bad. But this is going to be, it's so shallow. It's going to be right. Anyway, that's just a word to the wise. And it turns out that not all of the cruise ships, some of the cruise ships actually burn their waste, and so the particulate, again, goes up. Some of the cruise ships just blow it out on the outer edge of the lagoon. And when we were there in 1998, there was a mayor that was against bringing more. He wanted less tourists to come. He was a cool guy. And he said the cruise ships, they eat on board, they sleep on board, all they leave us is their sewage. And he put up posters. There was a Venice at Night campaign out there. Some of you may have seen the Venice at Night t-shirts. They had black rats on them. You know what I mean? It was like there was a whole campaign to sort of discourage people from coming there. That's changed. In the last, well, since the new mayor, they've instituted a whole new trash program. And there are guys that come to your place every day. And on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, you put out glass and plastic. Every day, you put out things that rot. And they clean up every day in this big attempt to cut down on the rats, basically. And it's worked really well. I mean, between the last time I was there and this time, it really has. You can really see that there are. And I for a long time, I was a proponent of the resurgence of Ratus ratus. I thought the Black Plague would be a good thing for this planet. Less people. In fact, there are towns I would suggest the initial release. So I'm gonna see if anyone. I'm gonna read this last poem and then see if anyone wants to ask a question, because a lot of you have been to Venice, so you might tell me about if anyone has a good stone story or something that because this is just the tiny, superficial. I was trying to think of what might be interesting and not completely boring. Beth told me I might be as boring as granite. Everything is holy. Bless the lagoon, sweet St. Lucy. Bless the birds. Bless the fish. Bless the trees on the outer islands. Bless the waves and the wind. Send the cruise ships to hell. There is room there for one more boat. If anybody has a question or a stone or something. Catherine.
Gary, you gave us sort of a wonderful overview, but you also suggested that everything there has come from somewhere else. But you spoke at the same time of wonderful experiences of speaking with people who are Venetian. And I wonder if you could share with us something of those experiences which you deemed authentic, where you felt you went deeper than some of the offering we've heard.
Well, Catherine's talking about experiences that I really deemed authentic or deeper with the local folks. 2/3 of the locals over the last 20 years have left the island and now live on the mainland. They've come by train or bus to work every day. There's less than 60,000 people living there now, and there were 150,000 like 15 years ago. So a lot of the people live on the mainland, and a lot of the people, like, we were told that there was one kind of booth that was controlled by the Sri Lankans. And there were other kinds of services that were controlled by North Africans. There were these interesting ethnic communities. A lot of beggars, And my friend Sandro, who's a native Venetian, said to talk to the beggars. And so we started talking to them. Nobody talks. You know? And we also started treating, like one place we started complimenting, one place we really loved the food, so we went out and told the chef that we really loved the food. Sorry. But we met musicians, we met like street musicians we would talk to about what they were doing, we met artists, we always tried to treat the workers like they were us and we were them. You know, not pull that ugly American, you know, I'm somehow better than you because I come from a country that has Trump as the president. That's hard to pull off, these things, you know? Venice may become a shithole country, actually, control the sewage, you know. So, but it was more about treating people as humans with whom you wanted to communicate, more than just the passage of money. I mean, there's that whole strip that's all now little gift shops that runs from the train station all the way to St. Mark's. There are 3 McDonald's and 2 Burger Kings on that strip, and a Disney store.